So we talked about color, we talked about color spaces, we talked about interlace. Just to recap what we're talking about today is the building blocks of video. Another one of these building blocks is the frame rate. And the frame rate, pretty straightforward, but it refers to the speed at which individual still images are captured by a recording or projected on a screen. It's measured in frames per second, or FP/S, or sometimes abbreviated just to FPS. And remembering always that all video is made up of still pictures. So you want to win a bar bet, you could tell people that video isn't actually moving pictures. The pictures don't move. The frames move. The pictures are still. Right? Each individual image that you show, each frame is not moving. It's still. What makes it look like it's moving is that repeated frame after frame after frame, right? So you can see, for example, in this very basic illustration that more frames mean more data. 60 frames a second compared to 30 frames a second, which is half of that, compared to 24, which is a little less than half, compared to 12, which is near a quarter of the number of frames, right? Or half of 24. So each one of those bars represents data. What's the historical reason for frame rates? The foundations, I shouldn't say reason. Well, one of them is the 24 frames that they decided on for film in the 1920s. And the other ones are the 25 frames per second that Europe and Asia decided on, and parts of South America for PAL and CCAM, and 30 frames a second for North America, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Japan. I think Venezuela was NTSC in South America. A lot of it's political, countries that were getting aid in other parts of the world from some of the first world countries. They adopted television systems based on the aid they were getting. So for example, the French developed CCAM. The French, for a time, were aiding the Soviet Union when it was still existing back in the day. And so the Soviet Union was was actually the largest country in the world, and they had a CCAM television system for a while because they were getting technology from the French. CCAM was eventually dropped in favor of PAL, but nonetheless, it's still 25 frames either way. Here's a quick map of the world showing that NTSC. This is the analog world back in the day. NTSC in green, CCAM in orange, and these are the countries that were getting aid from France. France was also CCAM, and then PAL, which was a German system. I think originally it was developed by the Germans, and that spread around the world. And there you go. There's a wrinkle with 30 frame NTSC, and that is that we often say 30 frames when we mean 2997. This is a common mistake that people make. Just for shorthand, we'll say 30 frames a second, but we actually mean 2997, right? So you want to double check that someone means actually 30 frames or not. It's unlikely they mean 30 frames because we don't usually shoot in an even 30. And remember, the history was, just to go back as to why 2997 frames per second. That's because of that whole compatible standard, and didn't want people to junk their television sets, right? So here's where it gets a bit thick. Here's where I might want to go to a video. Let me just look at this text for a second. Okay, I'll explain the definition of what drop frame is, what this 2997 number means. And then I think I'm going to go to a video here. And let me just have a look and see if I've got it ready. I think I should. Hang on a second while I have a quick look. Cancel. Bear with me here. Okay. Here's the definition of drop frame. Every minute, the numbering of the first 2 video frames of the first second are omitted. Okay, I'm going to read this slowly. Even though I'm reading off the screen, I hate doing that. As a result, the frame following 005929 is in fact 010002. Okay, so those 2 frames that you see those numbers for are back to back. And that makes up for the lost time in lowering the frequency from 30 to 2997. Because 2997 means they had to slow down the frame rate. Remember, we said that. And so by slowing down the frame rate, it's buggering up the counting. So, but it's even more complicated than that. If you did that every second, the time code would start to drift. So what they do is that every 10 minutes, they count every frame. All right. So that's the definition of drop frame. It's quite confusing. But the important thing to remember, and this is what's confusing as well, they call it drop frame, but in fact, no frames are dropped. The numbering is dropped. So when we say that 00005929 is, let's say it's frame A, and 00010002 is frame B, frames A and B are one after the other. We haven't dropped any frames, but we've dropped the 2 digits. We've dropped 00010000 and 00010001. Okay? I will stop there for a second because that's always a little confusing, and we'll go to the questions. Any questions about that drop frame thing? So no frames are dropped, numbers are dropped. All right. In fact, I'm going to recording. There. Go. All right. Okay, here's the video.
Or so with a real world clock, but this can introduce a lot of errors. Instead, what engineers developed was a counting system called drop frame, which corrects this issue. Contrary to what sounds, no frames are actually dropped in drop frame time code.
So a couple of things, even he stumbles over saying it because it is kind of complicated. Secondly, when he's talking about counting systems a little bit at the beginning, so keep in mind that when you had even frame numbers, because you were using power, 60 cycle power as your clock, and I use air quotes around clock, you had a clock system and a time code counting system that were in sync. In other words, every 30 frames, 30 cycles of power had gone by, you know, that kind of thing, right? But when you introduced this changing the frequency, lowering the frame rate, you came out of sync with that. And that's why we had to invent a drop frame system in order to get back in sync with the clock, the power system clock that we were using to time all of our equipment.
Think of it more as reverse leap year. Instead of adding a day every 4 years, we just skip certain numbered frames. Let's examine the drift after 1 minute of video. A minute of true 30 frames per second video has 1800 frames. A minute of 29.97 frames per second video has 1798.2 frames of video. We have to make up that extra 1.8 frames after 1 minute video. So when we count frames of 29.97, we go from 59 seconds and 29 frames to 1 minute and 2 frames. We skipped 1 minute 0 frames and 1 minute 1 frames. Now we're 0.2 frames ahead of the real clock. So fast forward to the next minute. Again, we skip counting 2 minutes and 0 and 2 minutes and 1 frame and go straight from 1 minute 59.29 to 2 minutes and 2 frames. Now we're 0.4 frames ahead. We continue doing this, dropping 2 frames at the start of each minute till we get to the 10th minute. Now we're 1.8 frames ahead. So the 10th minute, we don't skip counting any frames. We go from 9:59.29 to 10 minutes even, and then 10:01, and so on. So now 10 minutes of our 29.97 frames per second drop frame is exactly the same as 10 minutes in the real world. Now that does sound a bit confusing, but you will never ever need to manually count frames like that. That's the editing computer's job, and you can often switch between drop frame and non-drop frame depending on the needs of your project. Drop frame is designated with semicolons between the numbers or a period before the frame count, whereas non-drop frame uses colons. Now you really only need drop frame if you're formatting something to be going on broadcast television. If you're working on a movie or a video for the web, you can work safely without drop frame. And remember, no frames are actually being dropped. It's only a matter of how we count the frames. So you can switch between the two, and the only thing that will change is your total running time of your project.
Okay. I hope that it might be a bit more clear than me. So it's really only an issue for broadcast, and that's television broadcast over the air. It's not streaming, it's nothing else. And I mention it because you guys will be doing some broadcasting here at BCIT. Whether you'll move on to broadcasting after this is up to you. When he says that nothing will change if you switch back and forth, the only thing that might change is if you've made notes as to what the time code is on a certain shot. If you change the numbers, the notes change, right? So if, for example, you're writing down notes based on the time code, and then someone comes along later and changes the time code, there's actually a term for that. It's called restriping. If they replace the time code with regular time code that isn't drop frame, then your numbers will be different, right? But if that doesn't matter, and it'll only be different, as you can see, by 1.8 seconds every 10 minutes, or probably 1.8 frames every 10 minutes. So it's not a huge deal, but that's about it. The only time it's a problem is if you mix time codes in a project. It's best to pick one and stay with it, all right? So that's kind of the time code discussion. As he says, it's confusing. Everyone who just explains every video that you see on the web where someone knowledgeable talks about time code, almost the first thing they say is this is going to be confusing. It is confusing. It is a thing. It's one of those things that I wish it would have gone away 20 years ago when we went digital. I don't know why it didn't. And here we are to this day still talking about it. It's still a thing, right? Okay. So, okay, so back to the share. Okay, what have I done? Oh, okay, and go share screen. And we'll carry on. Share. Play from current. Okay, so all that blather is all that blather. Here, by the way, so where you're going to come across these is if you're working in other formats, you're going to see these other these other two time codes, 23976, also called 2398, which is 24 frame drop code, stop, breath, 23976 or 2398 is 24 frame drop frame compatible time code. So if you are working on a drop frame video project at 2997, your film frame rate or your 24 frame rate should be 2398. And then the two will line up properly. If you shoot a whole 24 and then edit in 2997, your timecode numbers will drift. That'll be a problem. That's why I say that'll mix your frame rates. And the other one for high def is 5994, which is simply the doubling of 2997. Is that right? 5994, 99 is 18. Yeah, I think that's right. So those are your other two compatible frame rates. So if you're working in any one of these three frame rates, then all your other material has to be working in the other frame rates in order for the stuff not to drift. And by drift, I mean have the frames move back and forth. The counting moves back and forth. Some software will be confused if the time codes are mixed. You'll have an alert comes up that says, hey, you've got a time drop frame here. Did you mean to do that? You'll get all kinds of errors if you mix them. None of them are fatal. None of them are fatal. Keep that in mind. Okay, it's not a thing in much of the rest of the world. A day like today, when I'm giving this lecture, is a day that I wish I was in, like Sweden or the Czech Republic or Czechia, I guess they're called now, where they didn't ever have drop frame, and we could talk about non-drop frame forever because they didn't have drop frame. Because when they went along and came out with color, these countries dropped their black and white system and forced people to buy new TVs. The Americans decided not to do that. And I say the Americans, I don't mean to blame them per se, but they were the ones who made the decision. They're the ones that decided to have a drop frame time code and a color compatible system because they didn't want to alienate the audience that already had a lot of televisions. But as you can imagine, especially after World War II, a lot of countries in Europe and elsewhere around the world were very poor and didn't have television sets. It was a rare thing to have a TV in some countries for quite a while. So therefore, people often bought a color TV as their first television. So the color televisions didn't have to be compatible. And here we are today. So moving on, enough talk about drop frame timecode. Let's talk about frame rates. So now we're going to talk about the different frame rates you might encounter when you're working Of course, the first one is 24 frames a second, and this is the film frame rate. Almost always movie theaters, whether they're video or film projection, use this frame rate. Some video equipment will not pass 24p without conversion. You don't want the equipment to do the conversion without some sort of intervention from you, because it doesn't always choose the best way to convert. So if you're up converting 24 to 30 or to 50, use software like Media Encoder. Don't just simply let the software say, I need to change the frame rate. Is that okay? Yes, because you may not be happy with the result. And the reason that is, and we'll talk about that more in detail later on this term, is there's different ways to convert that frame rate to make it look better or worse. Okay, 2398, high definition with NTSC, like I said, television compatibility, right? So it's a good way to shoot on film if you're transferring to video, or you're shooting on 24p and you're transferring to video, all right? 25 frames per second, this is the European PAL standard. The good thing about 25 FPS, when you're shooting 24p in film, it's only a slight change. It's a 1% speed change, maybe even less than 1% to get to 25. It's, I guess, 0.5% actually. What they do when they shoot film, when they project that film in Europe on television or in video, they simply speed the film up 0.5%. It's that simple. And you get to 25, close enough to 25 frames. We already talked about 2997. This is the drop frame standard. Make sure that people mean 2997 or not 30 if they say 30. True 30 frames. Some cameras will shoot at 30 frames, but it's seldom used. It doesn't really have a lot of utility anymore. So when it was black and white, when television didn't have color, it was true 30 frames, by the way. But back when that happened, just so you know, there was no recorders. Television, before color was invented, there was no way to record video. So frame rate didn't really matter because it was live. All right, 50 is double the frame rate of PAL, also sometimes known as PAL HD. So some 1080, in order to be compatible with the PAL systems in Europe and other places, some cameras will have a 1080i 50, PAL 50. This is HD, 5994 is the HD with broadcast compatibility. It is also the interlaced field rate of NTSC video. And what that means is if you count the fields, the half frames of NTSC, they are at 5994 because, of course, they're half the frame twice as often, okay? 60p, sometimes called true 60, pardon me, 60 FPS, sometimes called true 60 FPS. Some equipment will often record at this, but again, 5994 is more compatible, so it's used more often. So then we'll talk about frame rates as effects. You've got, didn't mean that to change. So the ones I just showed you, the frame rates I gave you just up to this point, are the frame rates that are used in editing, post-production, broadcasting, projection, etc. Now we're going to talk about frame rates that exist, but aren't yet standards for anything other than generally effects or, you know, things like motion smoothing. So the first one is the 1 to 16 frame per second. And that's a range, anywhere from 1 frame per second to 16 frames per second. Video will look choppy. It'll look like old-timey movies, or it'll look jerky. That's intentional, right? 60 frames per second is good if you want to get people walking. Now, the expectation with we shoot at 60 frames a second is you're going to play it back at 30, at 2997 or 30. And therefore, you're going to slow things down ever so slightly. But I'll tell you, you can get a really nice sort of dramatic effect if you shoot people when they're walking or moving in a frame at 60 and then play it back at 30. You get a nice dramatic sort of walk, right? But keep in mind that it's an effect. It will look unnatural, so you'll have to be doing it on purpose. 120 frames per second is good to slow things down that are fast. So if people running, animals running, you shoot at that higher frame rate and then slow it down. 240 is good for slowing down action, things that move quickly, like balloons exploding, water splashes. 480 frames per second is for things like really fast moving objects, like skateboard tricks, surfing, etc. And higher frame rates than 400 are hyper slowed down motion. Yeah, so here's a question about the shutter speed. I will get to that in a second because That's an important thing to remember, and we're going to talk about shutter speed actually almost immediately here. Understand one thing, the frame rate never changes. Once you've selected the frame rate for your production, let's say 30 frames, just because it's easier to talk about this. Once you've chosen 30 frames, every frame that you make will happen 30 times a second. But what the shutter speed is how long the aperture of the camera is open during that 30th of a second. So if you think of a frame rate, 30 frames a second, every frame is 1/30th of a second. Okay? And that's fixed. You can't change that. No matter what you do at the shutter speed, it's always going to be 1/30th of a second. So let's watch this video now and see if this helps explain to you what is going on with frame rate. So boink, boink.
Your shutter speed is a very important thing to consider when you're shooting video on DSLR cameras. If you've done photography before, you know that shutter speed essentially determines how much motion blur you're going to have in your images. The same concept holds true for video, but there's an added twist that I won't get into until the second half of this tutorial. We're going to start off by showing how to set shutter speed
we're going to move past
image.
Okay.
Because we're exposing each for one, meaning each.
So I'm just skipping the how to set up the camera for shutter speed because that's different for every camera.
So pretty fast. Right now our shutter speed setting says 400, meaning each frame is being exposed for 1/400th of a second. Because we're exposing each frame so briefly, there's minimal motion blur, and we can see the fan blade clearly, and we can even make out the writing on the t-shirt. If we slow down our shutter speed, say from 1/400th of a second to 1/30th of a second, the first thing you'll notice is that we need to shrink our aperture, that's the size of our lens opening, in order to compensate for the extra light we're getting with a longer exposed image. We'll discuss aperture more in a later video. For now, notice that we have an image with about the same brightness as our previous sample, but with much more motion blur. Because each frame is being exposed for a longer period of time, more movement is being captured in each individual still frame of the video. If we slow down the footage, you can really see what I mean by this. If we slow it down even further and start advancing our movie frame by frame, you might notice that even though the video on the left has a much faster shutter speed, the fan blades in both videos are covering the same amount of distance between each frame.
Okay, I'm going to stop right there. So what he just said was the fan blades are covering the same amount of distance. That's because the same amount of time has passed between frames in both examples. The time the frame exists is the 30th of a second, no matter what. The exposure of that frame is what the shutter speed is talking about.
Well, this is that extra twist I was talking about earlier. A lot of people get confused between a video camera's frame rate and a video camera's shutter speed. Most of these people, and I was once one of them, confuse the shutter speed of the camera for the frame rate and think, well, if I shoot an image at a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, then that means my camera is capturing 400 images each second, so there should be less jump between each frame. This is wrong. The frame rate of your camera does not change with shutter speed. That's why both fan blades appear to skip the same amount of space between each individual frame. The frame rate of your camera has to be set manually by pressing the Q button and navigating to the second last option. You can see the Canon T2i really has 3 frame rates available, 24, 30, and 60. Note that 60 frames per second is only available in 1280 by 720 resolution. The important point to remember here is that these frame rates remain 24, 30, and 60 frames per second regardless of your shutter speed settings. What does change with shutter speed is the exposure time of each of the 30, 24, or 60 frames that are being taken each second. Let's demonstrate what 1 second of video recording might look like if you were shooting at 30 frames per second and if your camera was exposing each frame for 1/30th, 1/60th, or 1/90th of a second. The white square will represent how long the shutter stays open for per each of the 30 frames. You can see that in each frame, the shutter speed determines the amount of time that each frame is exposed for. The bottom shutter speed is exposing the light sensor for 1/3 of a frame, and so it's a 1/90th of a second exposure. The middle setting holds the shutter open for half the length of an individual frame and is a 1/60th of a second exposure. The top setting is opening the shutter for the entire duration of the frame, and so it's a 1/30th of a second exposure. Notice that regardless of how fast the shutter speed is, they're all getting 30 frames per second. When we shoot with a shutter speed of 1/400th of a second, our camera is still taking 30 frames each second, but it's taking the 30 frames that it captures each second and exposing each individual frame for 1/400th of a second. In this case, the camera exposes one frame for 1/400th of a second, then waits for the next frame and exposes a new image for 1/400th of a second again. The result is a crisper looking frame, but not more frames per second. If there were more frames per second, the fan wouldn't appear to jump forward in each frame, but would have a seamless flow of images like this shot of an owl taken with a special slow motion camera that shoots 1,000 frames every second instead of 30. In the case of our second fan shot, each of the 30 frames captured every second is being exposed for a full 1/30th of a second, and that's what causes the motion blur in each individual frame. So, frame rates are set and determine how many images are taken each second, and shutter speed determines the length of exposure for each of those individual frames. When shooting on the T2i or other DSLR cameras with video capability, a tried rule of thumb is to aim for a shutter speed that is double the amount, or as close as possible to double the amount, of your frame rate. So that means if you're set at 30 frames per second, then shooting with a shutter speed of 60 will give you the best results, especially if your shot has a lot of camera movement.
Okay, so I hope that explains it a bit, and I'll stop the share here. The trick is, and what you should sort of keep in mind, always, I keep saying that video is not moving pictures. It's not motion. You're not capturing motion when you shoot video, right? So if you can remember that when you're shooting video, all you're really doing is taking a whole bunch of still pictures one after the other. And each still picture stands on its own. Each frame can be extracted and shown as a still image, just like you would do if you took a still photograph with your iPhone. That might help you better think about the fact that every single still image in a video sequence is a separate standalone still image with an exposure, aperture control, all these things that go with it. Now, the fact that they're all strung together really quickly makes it appear that things are moving, because you're capturing the still images very quickly one after the other, fast enough for your brain to think that that actually looks like motion. But the thing is, it isn't motion. Therefore, it also means that you can treat these still images like still images. And when you think about that, you realize that every still image in your camera, when you take a still picture, has an adjustable shutter speed. And what is the shutter speed? It's how long the light is exposed to the sensor while you're taking the picture. So the only difference is that the times that taking the picture in a video camera are fixed at 30 times a second. The video camera is going to take a picture 30 times a second, no matter what you do. But the shutter speed is controlling how long the light hits the sensor during that 1/30th of a second. Okay? I hope that explains that. It can be confusing because we tend to, and I do it myself sometimes, you tend to think that you fall into the illusion and think that the camera is capturing motion. It is not. It is capturing a very quick sequence of still pictures. Every single picture is independent, right? Okay. Now, when you think about it too, if you edit, and as I've done, when you edit, you're looking at nothing but still pictures, really. You're going down the timeline, making edits at the points between still pictures. So just keep that in mind, that you're dealing with still pictures at all times. That's the trick. And each still picture has aperture and shutter speed and other properties that a regular still photograph, a single photograph, would have. Okay, time code. What is time code? The first thing someone taught me when I started working in broadcasting is that time code is a black hole. And what that means is you can spend days and weeks and hours and months trying to figure out what time code's all about if you want to. It's like quantum physics. You can either turn the light on and assume that the light's working, or you can be a quantum physicist and start wondering how the photons are appearing in the universe and all those other photonic things, and drive yourself insane. I will try to touch on this next couple of slides on the sort of high-level time code topics that you need to know. So the most important things to know about the types of time code. The first one is called time of day. Time of day means that the time numbers that it records are the same numbers as the clock. Now, the difference is the clock, you have to set the clock because the camera doesn't know, or your phone. Well, your phone probably does know, actually, because it checks. But your camera probably doesn't know what the time of day is, unless your camera has a GPS built in, and then it does. Like drones, for example, have GPSs, which means they not only know where they are on the Earth, but they know what time it is. One of the key functions of GPS satellites is what time is it. right? So that's a byproduct of GPS, is you get the time. However, most of the time you have to set the clock in the camera. And when you set the clock to time of day, what that means is you make sure that the time code clock in the camera matches the actual time of day. And why that's important is because then when you take notes, as you will, because you're going to be good production people, you can use the clock on your phone as the note-taking time. You don't have to ask the camera operator, what was the time code for that shot? You know it was 1 hour, or pardon me, 1 p.m., 1:35 p.m., right? Now, if you need more detail than that, you can make your clock on your phone show seconds. If you need frames, then you would ask the camera operator, what frame did that happen at? Unlikely you're going to want frames. So that's what time of day means. Excuse me. Time of day works hand in hand with a feature called free run. So time of day only works properly if you allow the time code clock on the camera to continuously run all the time it's plugged in, turned on. If you turn the time code clock to record run, that means the clock only starts when you start recording. Now that has its advantage, we'll talk about that in a second. But when you're doing time of day, the clock on the camera has to run constantly. As soon as it stops running, it's out of sync with the clock, right? So you want to make sure when you're doing time of day, your time code on the clock, on your camera, pardon me, is set to free run. Then there's record run. So record run is handy because it will stop and start when you start and stop recording. What that means is there's no large gaps in the time code. The time codes between shots are next to each other. And it also means now you can customize your time code. It doesn't have to be the clock. And one of the key ways of customizing time code is to pick an hour of the day that represents the camera you're using, or the take that you're shooting, or the scene that you're shooting. So for example, you've decided that you're shooting scene 1 with this particular situation. You set the time code in the camera to read 1 o'clock. It starts at 00010002, right? Because it's drop frame. No kidding. So the time code clock in the camera is set to 1 o'clock. That means you now have an hour's worth of recording you can do with that 1 at the beginning. And that means you have an hour's worth of shots that you could make that are going to be numbered 1. The first digit will be 1, right? So what's handy about that is your editor and your people who do logging and note taking will know that anything with a 1 for the first digit is scene 1. Or if you decide it's camera 1 or it's day 1, right? It's all up to you. But it means by using record run, you can now use that time code as a bit of a secret code, all right? And lots of productions do this. So understand how to set your time code in your camera when you're working as a camera assistant, because your director may want a specific type of time code, all right? So here's a quick look at what time code looks like. Of course, here's 1 second at the beginning, then there's 1 minute, then there's 1 hour. So for example, in my situation before, if scene 1 is going to be shot on this camera, it's going to start with 01, and then you have 37 minutes and 14 seconds into scene 1, right? The last 2 numbers are drop frame time code, and they have the semicolons, and sometimes they're all semicolons. Sometimes it's just the last punctuation between the 59 and the 29 is a semicolon. And that's drop frame. And just a reminder that these 2 numbers, 00005929 and 00010002, these 2 frames are back to back. Okay. Film time code uses 24 frames per second and sometimes 48 and higher. The difference between film time code and video time code is typically film time code starts with the number 1, not 001000 like the clock, because there's no clock. I shouldn't say there's no clock. There's often no clock with film. They simply count the frames from 1 to 1,000,000 or whatever the number is, right? You can also use video time code in film. Film cameras, and of course, obviously cameras that are shooting video for film will use video time code, that 01, 02, etc. And this should have been at the beginning. The trick with time code is it's unique. You want to make sure that there's no duplicate numbers anywhere in your project. So the time of day thing is dangerous if you don't label your files as day 1, day 2, day 3. If you're shooting with time of day time code on Monday and then you come back on Tuesday and shoot again, you're going to have duplicate times because obviously the same time of day occurs every day of the week. So if you're shooting at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Monday and then you shoot at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Tuesday, you can get into trouble with your editing software if it finds the same time code twice, especially if you're searching for time code. So then it's a good idea to have different bins or folders. And Dave Berenbaum has probably talked to you about organizing your files. And if not, he will. Then you want to have different bins or folders or SD cards, however you want to manage it, with different days on them. That's if you use time of day, right? Because you should always have unique numbers. All right. And this is just a definition for dictionaries and the like. And so is this, and I'm going to skip that because we're getting short on the old hour. The other thing about timecode is this company called Timecode Burn-In for screening purposes. Sometimes Video Village wants this, and then you can see the timecode on the screen, right? So if you stop the camera or the director stops the video, you can see exactly what frame and field it is or what frame and hour it is and make notes accordingly. So it's important that timecode is continuous and ascending. There should not be duplicate timecodes in a shoot day. There shouldn't be ideally duplicate timecodes ever unless you've labeled everything properly. Set your clock manually if you want to add helpful data like scene number, camera number to your hours. Use those numbers as a code, and timecode really helps in editing.